Hey guys, Noel here, and it is Thursday morning. Before I go to bed, I wanted to do a little bit of a weblog for the professional wrestling weblog of the Noel Comics YouTube channel. One of my favorite things to do while I run on the treadmill is to listen to wrestling podcasts. And probably my favorite podcast to listen to is 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff and Conrad Thompson. Close second is Jeff Jarrett's My World with Conrad Thompson. Now, recently, Bischoff did an episode talking about his time in TNA. And so, I was someone who watched TNA religiously as long as it was on Spike TV. And I still tracked down TNA when it was on Destination America and Pop TV. And then once it got off that, I kind of I started having to watch it on Twitch and stuff once Kenny Omega showed up. And before Kenny Omega showed up, I just didn't care anymore. Let me take a sip of coffee here. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about my feelings about 2010 TNA, the Hogan Bischoff era of TNA, because on the one hand, I feel that time frame is the pinnacle, the peak of TNA, when it had the best roster in the world, when it had some of the most influential writing in the world. But at the same time, it became, I feel, internally problematic to the point where the company began to implode and decline. Once Hogan and Bischoff left, it started to decline on every level, and it sounds like while they were there, we're starting to decline internally as well. So I just wanted to kind of share some of my thoughts. Obviously, I'm just a fan. I don't have any inside information, but I do have an outsider's perspective, and Eric Bischoff is all about the outsiders. So what the heck? It's always good to have an outsider's insight. So I'll start off by saying I used to watch TNA wrestling scrambled on pay-per-view back when it was the weekly pay-per-view. And I just always felt like TNA always got bigger and better and bigger and better. They went from weekly pay-per-views on Wednesdays to cable television with FSN and their 3 o'clock time slot to I can't remember if they were on 10 or 11 on Spike TV. They used to be on an hour, in the later hours. And then they got Thursday prime time and 2 hours. It was always an upward trajectory for TNA. And Hulk Hogan was my favorite wrestler, and Hogan tended to wrestle for the WWE in the early 2000s. But despite that, I still preferred TNA as a wrestling company, even though my favorite wrestler didn't wrestle there. But when it was announced that Hogan and Bischoff were coming into TNA, I was really excited about that. What disappointed me was that when Hogan and Bischoff arrived in TNA, while I liked the product that they were putting out, there were elements of the product where I was like, I don't think Hogan and Bischoff actually know what TNA is. And there was a lot of repeating the formula of, what Hogan did when he went to WCW, and that had great benefit to WCW. I loved the mid-90s WCW. But what Hogan was doing, it was not working as well in TNA as it did in WCW. Mainly because the people that were brought into WCW in the mid-90s, I think, were better wrestlers than, for the most part, than a lot of the people that were being brought into TNA when Hogan was rolling in there. For example, Hogan, when Hogan got there, remember they brought in Bubba the Love Sponge, and Bubba the Love Sponge was pushing Jeremy Borash off television, and I was like, no. JB is part of TNA. I want to see JB be doing these backstage segments, right? I mean, there were other people that were coming in that I thought were good with Hogan. I thought that Ken Anderson was cool. I thought Rob Van Dam was cool. I even thought the Lady Gaga Orlando Jordan gimmick was entertaining. But there were things creatively that were done and said that really were kind of a turnoff to me as a longtime viewer of Impact. Namely, like when Hogan and Bischoff showed up, and I don't know if like Russo was writing this for Dixie Carter or I don't even know what was going on, but it was just kind of like, listen, you losers, I'm here to pull this shithole up, so get to the back of the line and prove your weight. And I'm thinking like, what? Like what I wanted this to be was Hogan elevating TNA even more with his star power. And that is ultimately what happened. Okay. But for the first bit of that, I'd say probably for like the first month or so, it was not good. And you could tell that like Hogan and Bischoff just did not understand the characters or what TNA was. And I don't even think they cared to, because I think they probably viewed TNA as like minor league and a payday and like, okay, well, I'll help these guys out and it'll make me look good and I'll make some money and hopefully it all works out and yeah. But like, that's a very different attitude than the attitude that you hear Jeff Jarrett have about TNA on his podcast, where it was like TNA was Jeff Jarrett's baby. You know, when you hear Jeff Jarrett talk about TNA, it's very similar to Eric Bischoff talking about WCW, down to the fact that they both tried to buy their companies to preserve them when they were in dire straits, right? You know, Bischoff was trying to buy WCW from Turner to save it. And Bischoff and Jarrett was trying to buy TNA from the Carters to save it with, Toby Keith. So, there's definitely there's a difference in, how Bischoff views TNA and once he gets power in TNA, what he does with it, versus Jeff Jarrett, which is like a father caring for its child, and wanting what's best for it. Whereas Bischoff, I think, just views TNA, from my perception, based on his podcast, as just kind of a money-making opportunity. And he would say things like, oh, yeah, we're taking TNA on the road. I hope it works out financially for him. Like, doesn't even give a shit, It's just like, yeah, I hope that works out for him, No perception of the fact that, like, it could financially cripple the company, but that's not my money, and I think you should do this. It'll make your show look good. But it's just like playing with house money, doesn't care, and like, this is, insane, because Bischoff, when he was in WCW, was the one who took WCW off the road when he came in to save money and make the company financially solvent. And when the company was in bad shape in the early 2000s, when he was going to buy the company with Fusion Media, his plan was to move Nitro to Las Vegas and have, Nitro just be a studio show in Las Vegas, a very high-end studio show with really good production values. But, Bischoff's advice to TNA as they're losing money is, yeah, take the show on the road. I hope it works out for you. What is that? Like, I mean, that type of attitude shows a huge lack of care for the product. And I understand why there was an exodus of wrestlers, because the people who had been busting their butts to, elevate TNA, are now all of a sudden being kind of pushed aside by, someone like Eric Bischoff, who's like, yeah, hey, I've got success and you guys don't have as much success as I had, so I know better than you guys, so shut up. And by the way, I'm frustrated because people aren't doing what I'm saying enough. So, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there, but Bischoff's attitude, on the one hand, his creative turned out to be some of the best creative TNA ever had, with the Immortal storyline and the Aces and Eights, and he was a good on-screen character, and he had some great ideas. But then there was just other stuff where it was just like, I don't know. He just seemed like he didn't care, and he didn't. And his not caring was like him using his influence to the point that it damaged the company, and he didn't care because it wasn't a company that he built. You know what I'm saying? Like, the worst thing, that he said on his podcast was, like, I wrote Dixie Carter clinging to Hulk Hogan's ankles as he shook the shit off of his shoe that was TNA. He didn't say that per se, but that was the gist of what he said. He's like, I didn't want Hogan having the stench of TNA on him. And it was like, you made the stench, okay? You're a big part of the stench, okay? You definitely contributed to a. Now, I'm not saying it was just Eric Bischoff, but I mean, the lack of care with which he talks about that company it kind of betrays, why people would be frustrated working under him in that company. And I think more people were frustrated with working under Dixie Carter, because the bottom line is that these people were not Jeff Jarrett, right? And so when Jeff Jarrett, was in charge, and Russo was coming up with like something for everyone to do, it felt much more like everything was like kind of firing on all cylinders. And once things got kind of muddied, that definitely, I think, hurt the morale and the financial stability of the company. And now this is what Bischoff said, and Bischoff is not wrong on this. He said to everyone, this is one of the reasons I was frustrated. He's what he said is like, Spike TV wanted to buy TNA or have a big stake in TNA. And the people internal to TNA were like, no, we don't want to give up power. But it's like, all right, you don't want to give up power, but you're spending the money poorly, and Bischoff's not giving you great financial advice. But if you had a major investor that had a high stake in your success, which is what Bischoff wanted, because Bischoff knew how to work with someone like Ted Turner, who's like, I will be your financial backbone. This will give you options. Okay. So Bischoff, he kind of like, I don't know, Bret Hart says Bischoff doesn't have a clue. But my childhood is filled with WCW that Bischoff ran, which was the best wrestling of all time. So what that causes me to deduce is that Eric Bischoff is like a coin. And on the one side of the coin is a brilliant thinker and person with, as Hulk Hogan would say, good instincts, that produces the best wrestling of all time. However, the other side of that coin is a complete lack of intellectual depth. And I don't know. That's just what it is with him, is what it sounds like from listening to his podcast. And I say that as someone who greatly admires Eric Bischoff. And if I was ever blessed enough to own a wrestling company, I would want Bischoff at the helm, just because he produced the wrestling that I loved when I was a child. But it would have to be his baby, or else I just don't think he'd give a shit about it. So I bring this up because, like, there's definitely a dimension of Hogan and Bischoff not understanding the quality of what TNA was before they got there. They knew that it was decent. They thought that they could contribute to it and improve it. And to a certain extent, they did. They objectively did. But when they got there, they didn't. I don't think they did their due diligence in understanding really what TNA was, which is kind of crazy because Hogan almost jumped to TNA back in like 2003, I think, when he did that Chono match. And Jarrett hit him in the head with a guitar. So I don't know. It's possible that, Dixie Carter she took over and was having Vince Russo write just bullshit. But like when Hogan and Bischoff came out and from 1 week on TNA, it's like we're this ascending company and we're on the cusp of greatness. We are truly bound for glory, and that's the name of our pay-per-view. And, after Hogan and Bischoff leaves, it's like, we're hard to kill. We're like that cockroach you can't quite get out of the bathroom, like, what? So it's like that whole thing of like, get to the back of the line, there's a new sheriff in town and, we're going to turn this minor league, crap hole into something that is, like God going over it, and everything in God's shadow somehow gets better. And that was not the right kind of attitude to have. However, I will say that within a couple months, they got their act together. And between the Immortal storyline and the Aces and Eights storyline, and you know, the insane roster that they had, which was the best in the world. And Eric Bischoff deserves every bit of credit for all of the great creative that he came up with in TNA. Aces and Eights was the most influential storyline of the 2010s. Absolutely. I think it influenced The Shield. I think it influenced Bullet Club, especially in its aesthetics. I mean, take a look at Doc Gallows in the Aces and Eights, and take a look at Doc Gallows in the Bullet Club. You know, and the whole kind of mystery of the masks too, like the NWO, but they're wearing like masks and they're like a sadistic biker gang. It was, and you know, AJ Styles' character flourished tremendously. I mean, the stupidity of AJ Styles being like a Ric Flair Jr. was some of the dumbest creative I've ever seen. But then him turning into the kind of like the dark, brooding AJ that walked the line between the Aces and Eights and WCW, using that Crow Sting trope, is something that AJ Styles aesthetically took with him to New Japan, to WWE, and it added huge dimensions to his character. In addition to that, you know, Jeff Jarrett, you know, working under the Hogan Bischoff like regime or whatever, his character flourished tremendously as he feuded with Kurt Angle. That was when Jeff Jarrett got with Karen Jarrett. That is truly, I think, when Jeff on screen. That's truly when I think Jeff Jarrett became a really top tier wrestler. That MMA Jeff Jarrett comedy stuff, and the quality of matches that Jeff Jarrett was putting out. I mean, he was kind of a late bloomer, I think, in terms of achieving his potential. But man, him in the 2010s of TNA, like when it was at its peak, and I consider the Hogan Bischoff era to be the peak of TNA, despite the fact that early on, I don't think they had enough respect for the company. But so that creative, like Immortal and Aces and Eights, and once Hogan and Bischoff left, you could feel their absence because the company just, you know. So while they might not have understood TNA at first, and while Bischoff just felt like he wasn't, you know, he wasn't playing with his own money, so he could just kind of throw out suggestions and try to bully people to get his own way, and not believe in the product and not care about the product, his creative contributions were really important, and he brought TNA to its highest heights. But it sounds like he contributed to a lot of bad morale backstage. So that's kind of my take on the Hogan Bischoff era of TNA. I loved it. But hearing the way that Bischoff talks about it kind of makes me annoyed. So until next time, guys, my name is Noel. You take care, and I'll see you in the very near future for more wrestling weblogs. Bye-bye.